They came for an auction. 30 men, maybe 40, standing in the cold like they always did when something was ending.
She had been waiting for this morning for a long time. No one in that yard knew it yet.
21 years had built to this. Every sale, every season, every coin she had ever saved.
The man from Springfield had worked 40 counties. He knew what that number meant the moment he heard it. She had 35 cents once. Now she held something no one in that yard had seen coming.
The autumn of 1895 arrived in Holt County, Missouri, the way it always did, without apology, stripping the cottonwoods along the creek bottoms down to their gray bones and pulling the last warmth out of the ground before anyone was quite ready to let it go. On a Tuesday morning in October, the kind of morning where your breath showed white before you reached the barn, a crowd gathered in the yard of the Stritch place on the East Road out of Gravelton. They came in wagons and on horseback and on foot. Men mostly, their coat collars turned up against the wind, standing in the particular configuration that people adopt when they are present at something they did not cause and cannot stop. Hamp Rudd stood on the bed of a flatbed wagon with a sheaf of papers in one hand and his hat held flat against his chest with the other, and he read the legal description of 160 acres of Holt County farmland in the flat, practiced voice of a man who had been doing this too many times in too few years. When he finished reading, he looked out at the crowd and asked who would start the bidding at $22 an acre. A woman near the back of the crowd wrote a check that morning for $4,480. The crowd went quiet when she said her number. Not the polite quiet of an auction proceeding in order, but the particular silence that settles over a group of people when they have to rearrange. All at once. Everything they believed they understood about a person standing in front of them. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand what happened on that Tuesday morning in October, you have to go back 21 years to a farm sale outside Gravelton and a 9-year-old girl with 35 cents in her coat pocket. The Dillard Pool place had sat empty since March of 1874, when Dillard Pool died of a fever that the doctor in Gravelton diagnosed too late to do anything about. He had no children and his wife had preceded him by 6 years, and the farm, 140 acres on the northwest edge of Holt County, with a house that needed roofing and a barn that needed everything, passed to a nephew in St. Joseph who had no interest in farming it and every interest in converting it to cash. Hamp Rudd ran the liquidation on a Friday in late April. The ground was soft from 3 days of rain, and the sky was the particular pale gray of a Missouri spring that cannot decide whether it is finished being winter. Wagons lined both sides of the road coming in. Men stood in groups near the barn and along the fence line, and the whole enterprise had the uneasy cheerfulness of people who understood they were buying what someone else had spent a lifetime building. Silas Calhoun brought his youngest daughter, because her mother had taken sick 2 days prior with a cold that had gone to her chest, and there was no one at home to leave the girl with. Verity Calhoun was 9 years old and small for it, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's habit of watching things longer than other people watched them before deciding what she thought. She wore a wool coat that had been let out at the sleeves twice, and boots that had belonged to her brother Ord before he outgrew them. She had 35 cents in the right pocket of that coat, 7 nickels accumulated over 4 months of feeding the chickens and carrying water to the barn and performing the small economies of labor that her father paid in coin, because he believed that a person who did not learn to accumulate young would never learn to accumulate it at all. Hamp Rudd worked through the sale with the efficiency of a man running slightly behind schedule. A good plow went for $3.40. A set of harness in fair condition brought $1.75. 2 milk pails, a wash basin, and a coil of rope sold as a lot for 60 cents to a man who wanted the rope and didn't much care about the rest. Near the end of the morning, when the men around the wagon were beginning to think about their dinner and whether the weather was going to hold, Hamp Rudd reached into the bed of the wagon and lifted a wooden crate by its rope handle. The crate was heavy enough that it swung when he raised it, and the contents shifted with the dense, clinking weight of iron. He held it up and looked at the crowd with the expression of a man who has run enough sales to know which lots are not going to generate much enthusiasm. The crate was packed with horseshoes, old ones, worn ones, shoes that had been pulled off dead or sold horses and thrown into a barn corner the way that things accumulate in barns when no one can quite bring themselves to throw them away, but no one needs them either. Some were welded together with rust. Several still had the bent stubs of nails through the holes. 2 were cracked straight across the toe, the kind of break that happens when a horse goes down hard on frozen ground and doesn't recover. The iron was dark with oxidation, and the whole crate smelled of old metal and the particular damp of a barn that hadn't been properly ventilated in years. "Somebody want this," Hamp Rudd said. "It's heavy." The men standing around the wagon looked at the crate the way they looked at everything at the end of a farm sale, with the mild, slightly exhausted assessment of people who have already bought what they came for. A few of them shook their heads. One of them said something quiet to the man standing next to him, and the man laughed. Verity Calhoun raised her hand. She had to raise it twice before Hamp Rudd saw it. When he did, he looked at her for a moment with the blank pause of a man recalibrating. She pushed through to the front of the group, her father watching from 8 feet away with an expression that gave nothing away. And she counted out 35 cents on the tailgate of Hamp Rudd's wagon. 7 nickels, every coin she had. The laughter that followed was not cruel. That distinction matters. The men around that wagon were not bad men, and they were not laughing at a child in the way that has malice in it. They were laughing because what they had just witnessed was, by any reasonable measure, the most purely inexplicable thing that had happened at a Holt County farm sale in recent memory. A 9-year-old girl in a handed-down coat paying 35 cents, the entirety of her accumulated savings, for a crate of rusted iron that a grown man would have had to be paid to haul away. It was the kind of thing that was funny precisely because it was harmless, because the money was small and the iron was worthless, and no one could imagine what possible logic existed inside the head of a child that arrived at this conclusion. The story made it to Gravelton before the wagons did. By Saturday, it had reached the feed store on Main Street and the tack shop on the south end and the gathering after Sunday services at First Methodist, where it was told with a warmth that small communities are just for the inexplicable behavior of children. Affectionate, a little baffled, entirely certain that nothing of consequence had happened. Silas Calhoun's girl had spent her allowance on scrap iron. She had carried that crate home in her lap in the wagon. She had put it in the barn like it was worth something. They laughed for years, and the laughter was easy, and it cost them nothing. They stopped laughing in the autumn of 1895. But that part comes later. Silas Calhoun had not broken the ground on the family's 280 acres with his own hands. The work had been his father's before it was his, and before that it was the prairie. And the prairie gave nothing without a negotiation conducted in sweat and equipment, and the willingness to be wrong about the weather until you learned to read it correctly. Emmett Calhoun the elder had filed his claim in 1839 when Holt County was still mostly open grass, and the nearest town of consequence was a day's ride in the right conditions. He had broken 60 acres the first year and strained his back doing it, not permanently but seriously enough that it affected how he moved for the rest of his life, and he had farmed those 280 acres until his hands no longer worked well enough to hold the reins. Then he had handed it to Silas, with the same instruction he had apparently received from his own father. Don't owe what you can't pay back, and don't pay back what you never needed to borrow. Silas had taken this further than most men of his generation thought was necessary. He did not believe in buying new what could be made from old. He did not believe in paying a man to do what he could learn to do himself. He did not believe under any circumstances in debt, not the operating kind, not the expansion kind, not the kind that the bank on Gravelton's Main Street was increasingly good at making sound like common sense. His shop was a limestone block building behind the house, 40 feet long and 20 wide, with a corrugated tin roof and a wood stove in the northwest corner that he fired with hedgewood from October to April, the smoke coming off it in the morning with the particular blue-gray of dry wood burning clean. The workbench along the north wall was made from 2-inch oak plank he had milled himself from a tree that had come down in a windstorm in 1861, and it ran the full length of the building. Above it, on a section of board he had mounted against the limestone wall, hung his tools in an arrangement that was less about aesthetics than about function. Each tool in a position that made the next motion easier. Each group organized by what it did rather than what it looked like. The forge in the southeast corner he had purchased secondhand from a blacksmith in Dade County who was retiring in 1851. It was a champion-style hearth with a hand-cranked blower, and Silas had brought it home in the wagon bed wrapped in canvas and spent 3 evenings installing it with a plumb line and a precision that his wife had described once, without unkindness, as the behavior of a man who had confused a piece of equipment with a cathedral. The forge had been burning in that corner ever since, every morning through every season, in a particular rhythmic way that something becomes part of a place when it has been there long enough. What Silas taught Verity was not a trade exactly. It was a way of seeing, and the distinction matters more than it might appear to at first. He taught her to read the grain of iron, to distinguish shoe to shoe that had been worked by someone who understood what they were doing, from one that had been shaped in a hurry by someone who didn't. He taught her to feel in a piece of metal whether it had been worked hot or cold, and what that meant for what you could do with it next. He taught her that rust was not the end of something. It was time made visible, and time could be addressed with heat and abrasive and patience. He taught her that the difference between scrap and raw material was almost entirely a matter of who was looking at it. She was 11 the morning he showed her the horseshoe. Not the crate from the pool sale. Those were still on the shelf in the barn, sorted into categories she had begun to work out with the logic of a child who had decided, without fully articulating it to herself, that organization was a form of intention. He was working on a shoe for one of their own horses, a draft cross named Temperance, who had thrown a shoe on the east field and come in uneven that afternoon. Silas had the shoe in the forge, watching the color change with the patience of a man who had learned that impatience in this particular activity had consequences he would be dealing with for weeks afterward. When it reached the right color, not red, not orange, the specific yellow-white that meant the iron was ready to move, he pulled it with the tongs, set it on the anvil, and began working it with the hammer in the short, precise strokes that looked effortless, only because they were the product of 30 years of daily practice. Verity stood beside him and watched the way she watched everything in the shop, fully, without the fidgeting that characterized most of her attention elsewhere. He said, without looking up from the work, "A horseshoe is one of the most precisely made things on a working farm. The weight, the width, the angle of the heel caulks, the placement of the nail holes, all of it specific to the horse, the terrain, the work it does. A good horseshoe is not a simple thing. It is someone having understood exactly what was needed and having the skill to make it." He set the shoe on the anvil and looked at it for a moment. Most of the people look at a horseshoe and see good luck. He turned it over once with the tongs. "I see 30 years of metallurgy." Verity was 11 years old when he said that. She did not forget it. The system she built around the horseshoes was not something she had been told to build. It grew out of the combination of her father's instruction and her own particular habit of mind, which tended toward classification in the way that some children's minds tend toward story or calculation. She began buying horseshoes at every liquidation sale and farm clearance within a reasonable distance, paying with her allowance first, then with money she earned helping neighbors during harvest, then with the wages she accumulated when she was old enough to hire out for serious work. She sorted them on the shelf her father built for her along the east wall of the shop, organizing first by size, then by the quality of the iron, then by the style of the nail holes, which varied enough across regions and decades to be a meaningful distinction to someone who had learned to look. She labeled the groupings in her own hand, the labels precise in the way that her father's tool arrangements were precise. Not for the appearance of organization, but for organization made possible. By the time she was 16, she had more than 200 shoes cataloged on that shelf. By the time Ord left for Kansas City, she had passed 350. The crate from the pool sale had long since been disassembled, cleaned, sorted, and distributed across the categories, and the original 35 cents of investment had become, through the slow accretion of years, a raw material inventory that would have been difficult to replicate for any real amount of money, not because the shoes were rare, but because finding them required being at the right sale at the right time with the willingness to carry iron home that everyone else had already decided was without value. Nobody in Holt County knew the collection existed. The story they still occasionally told was about a 9-year-old at the pool sale. They had no reasons to update it. Ord left in the spring of 1883. He was 20 years old, and the farm was not the life he had ever fully committed to, in the way that commit requires actually deciding rather than simply remaining. There was a railroad crew hiring in Kansas City, and he had a friend who had gone the previous year and written back with numbers that made farming look, by comparison, like a very slow way to make very little money. He was not wrong about the numbers, and he was not a bad man for going, and Silas understood both of these things and said so to Verity on the evening after Ord's wagon disappeared down the east road. Standing at the kitchen window with his coffee, the particular expression of a man who has processed something and moved past the processing into the practical question of what comes next. What came next was that the work shifted, not all at once, not through any formal announcement or negotiation, but in the gradual way that responsibility redistributes itself when the number of people carrying it decreases. Verity was 18 that spring, and she was already doing more than most people in the county gave her credit for doing, because most of them were not paying attention to what she was doing, only to the fact that she was a woman doing it. By the time the summer harvest was finished, she was running the field operations alongside Silas, with a competence that did not require his correction. By 20, she had taken over the books entirely, at Silas's suggestion and her own inclination, and she found in the columns and the ledger pages the same kind of clarity she found in the sorted horseshoes on the shop. A system that told the truth about where things stood, without sentiment, without adjustment for what you wished were true. Silas's heart began to give him trouble in the winter of 1885. The doctor in Gravelton had the particular combination of honesty and tact that good country doctors developed when they understood their patients were people who needed to plan. He told Silas that the heart was still working, but that it was working harder than it should for what it was being asked to do, and that the right response to this information was not panic but adjustment. Silas adjusted. He moved more of the fieldwork to Verity. He kept the shop, because the shop was something he had been doing for 40 years, and the idea of giving it up was nothing he was willing to consider, but he worked shorter days and took Sundays entirely off, which was a thing he had never done before in his adult life, and which felt, he told Verity once, like wearing someone else's coat. By the spring of 1887, Verity was running the farm, and Silas was in the shop, and this arrangement had settled into the kind of routine that feels permanent when it has lasted long enough. She was 22 years old. She had never seriously considered that this particular division would end before she was ready. The morning of March the 14th was cold in the way that March mornings in Missouri are cold. Not the deep cold of January, which is at least honest about itself, but the sharper, more surprising cold of a season should be finishing and hasn't yet. Silas had been in the shop since before first light. The previous week, their neighbor Olin Stritch had brought over a wagon wheel that had cracked at the hub during the hard freeze in February, and Silas had told him he would look at it when he had the time. Olin was behind on everything. The Stritch farm was not in good shape by any measure Verity could apply to it, and Silas had offered the repair as the kind of favor that neighbors in that county did for one another without invoking the language of debt or obligation. He had been working on it for 3 mornings. Verity came out of the house at 7:30 with 2 cups of coffee, one in each hand, the steam rising off them in the cold air. The shop door was open an inch, which was how Silas left it when the wood stove was going strong enough that the room didn't need to hold all its heat. She pushed it open with her shoulder. He was at the workbench, sitting on the stool he kept at the north end. His left hand was on the bench surface, fingers slightly open, the way a hand rests when the body is relaxed all at once rather than gradually. The wheel was on the bench beside him, the hub repaired, the iron banding reset and seated correctly, the whole assembly ready to go back on Olin Stritch's wagon. He had finished the job. Verity set both cups on the bench. She stood for a moment in the cold quiet of the shop, the wood stove ticking in the corner. She looked at her father, and she looked at the wheel, and she looked at her father again. She noted the wheel. She noted it the way he had taught her to note things, without the intrusion of feeling into the space where observation needed to operate. The information was he had finished the job. That was the kind of man he was. Everything else, all of it, would come later in its own time, and it did. He left her 280 acres of paid land. He left her the shop and everything in it. He left her the forge in the southeast corner that had been burning since 1851. He left her $1,200 in the Holt County Bank, accumulated over 4 decades of his absolute refusal to spend money he didn't have to spend, to borrow money he didn't need to borrow, to live at a scale beyond what the ground and the labor actually produced in a given year. There was no mortgage, there was no equipment loan, there was no line of credit, no outstanding balance, no obligation of any kind attached to anything he had built. It was, in the precise accounting sense, entirely free and clear. And Verity understood at 22 years old that this was not an accident or a windfall, but the result of 40 years of deliberate decision-making that had looked, to most people watching it, like stubbornness or failure of ambition. Ord came down from Kansas City for the service. He stayed 3 days, and on the second evening after supper, he sat at the kitchen table which he had said what he had come to say in the careful way of a man who has rehearsed something and knows it anyway. He thought she ought to consider selling some of the ground, not all of it. Enough to give herself operating room, cash on hand, the ability to weather a bad year without the farm itself becoming the collateral. He was not wrong as a point of general financial reasoning, and he said it with genuine care, not condescension. He had been calculating her situation from Kansas City with the arithmetic of a man who understood money in the abstract, been away from the specific texture of this ground and this operation long enough to make certain errors of assumption. Verity thanked him. She said she would think about it. She walked him out to his wagon on the 3rd morning and watched him down the east road, and then she walked to the shop and stood in the doorway for a while, with her hand woodabbied and looking at the bench and the tools and the forge cold in the corner and the shelf on the east wall, with its ordered rows of labeled horseshoes. She did not sell. What she did instead, over the fall and winter of 1887 and into the early months of 1888, was prepare. She had been preparing, in one sense, since 1874, but this phase of it was different, concrete and purposeful, and pointed toward a specific outcome that she had been able to see for years, but it had not been in a position to pursue until now. 3 months before she was ready to open the shop for business, she drove to Dade County, 38 miles southeast, a different county entirely, no connection to the stretch land that bordered her own to the east, to call on a man named Emmett Prawl. Emmett Prawl was 74 years old and had been shoeing horses in Dade County since 1838. His hands were the hands of a man who had been doing the same work for nearly 50 years, thick across the knuckles, scarred in the particular places where a tool slips or a horse moves wrong, still steady. He had placed a notice in the Dade County Courier the previous autumn that he was retiring and had tools to sell. And Verity had read the notice in a copy someone had left at the Gravelton feed store and kept it in her coat pocket for 2 weeks before deciding she already knew what she was going to do about it. She arrived at his place on a Thursday morning, and he met her at the gate with the wariness of a man who had lived long enough to be suspicious of unexpected visitors. What she was there for, he studied her for a moment with the flat, assessing look of someone deciding whether a thing is worth their time. Then he opened the gate. He took her through his shop for 2 hours. The hammer set, turning hammer, driving hammer, rounding hammer, each one's particular weight and balance, and the specific motion it was designed to produce. The nail pullers, the clinching block, the Pritchell tools for working the nail holes. He set each one in her hand and explained what it was for, and how he used it and what went wrong when you used it incorrectly. He was not performing generosity. He was doing what a man of 74 does when he has a body of knowledge that has nowhere to go, finding the one person in the room who was paying the right kind of attention and transferring what he could. Verity sat on a bale of straw near the door and listened to every word. She did not write anything down. She did not interrupt him once. She paid $19 for the lot. Everything he had laid out, the complete working kit of a man who had practiced his craft for half a century. He walked her to her wagon when she left and stood at the gate as she turned the horse. She lifted a hand. He nodded once, the nod of a man who has done what he set out to do and is satisfied with it. Back in Holt County, she spent the remainder of the winter restoring and mounting. The champion post vise she had found the previous October at an abandoned farm 12 miles north of Gravelton. $7. Jaws slightly sprung, screw seized, mounting plate cracked at one edge but not through the critical section. She repaired using the cast iron welding technique Silas had shown her. Slow heat building from the outside in the right rod for cast iron's particular brittleness. A cooling period so gradual she had to plan it across 2 days rather than one. She bolted it to the north end of the workbench where Silas's own vise had lived, in the same position, with the same orientation toward the forge. She freed the seized screw with a mixture of oil and spirits of turpentine applied across 3 sessions of careful heat, each followed by a waiting period that tested the patience she had been building since she was 9 years old. In the 3rd session, the thread moved, and then moved more freely, and finally moved the way it was supposed to move. She ran Emmett Prawl's tools through the hand-cranked grinding wheel on the bench till the rust clean metal, then treated the wooden handles with linseed oil and replaced the 2 that had cracked beyond usefulness with handles she shaped from ash stock in the shop. She fired the forge for the first time since March of the previous year. The coal caught slowly and then with more conviction, and the blower pulled the heat up through the hearth in the way that it always had, and the shops filled with the smell of burning coal and hot iron that had been absent for 12 months. Verity stood at the forge for a while before she started work, not for any ceremonial reason, but because the forge being cold had been one of the specific textures of Silas's absence, and the forge being lit again was a different kind of information. Not that anything was restored, exactly, but that the work was beginning again, which was a different thing. She worked through her horseshoe inventory through the winter, using the forge heat to test what she already knew from handling, separating shoes with the right carbon content for reshaping from those that had been made from inferior stock and would serve poorly under repeated stress. She had developed over years of sorting a tactile sense of the difference that was difficult to describe, but consistent enough in its results that she trusted it. The shoes that lacked the working quality went into a separate bin as pure stock, material for other purposes. The ones that passed went back on the shelf, reorganized by what they were now rather than what they had been. The total expenditure of the preparation phase counted out in the ledger she kept with the same precision Silas had kept his. The vise, $7. Emmett Prawl's tool lot, $19. Coal for the first winter supply, $12. Welding rod and flux, $3.50. Replacement grinding stone and dressing tool, $1.80. Linseed oil and handle stock for tools restoration, $4.20. Nails, clips, files, rasps, and a new set of measuring gauges, $28. Miscellaneous hardware and supplies, $8.85. The total came to $84.35. And if you counted the 35 cents she had put on the tailgate of Hamp Rudd's wagon at the pool sale 14 years earlier, the completed investment in what she was about to begin was $84.70. She had $1,200 in the Holt County bank that Silas had left her, untouched. Holt County at the close of the 1880s still ran on horsepower in the literal sense. Quarter horses for cattle work on the larger operations east of Gravelton, draft crosses for the grain farms, the occasional pure draft for the men who still ran heavy equipment the old way and saw no reason to change. All of these animals needed shoes. The nearest working farrier was 32 miles south, in a town in Carroll County. He charged $1.75 to $2.25 per horse, depending on the complexity of the work, plus the time and expense of the round trip, and he was running 6 to 8 week outs on us appointments because he was the only man doing this work within a reasonable distance of 4 counties. A rancher with 6 working horses was spending $15 or more every 6 to 8 weeks, plus a full day of someone's time to make the trip. Verity charged $1.25 per horse, no travel fee. She could generally get to you within the week. There was no announcement. She told no one directly. She mentioned it once to Winifred Goss at the dry goods store in Gravelton in February, in the course of a conversation about the difficulty of getting the farrier from Cal County, scheduled before spring work began, and Winifred mentioned it to her husband Fletcher that evening. And Fletcher Goss drove out to the Calhoun place on a Wednesday morning in March with the look of a man who has come because the alternative is worse, not because he has any particular confidence in what he is about to find. Fletcher Goss ran cattle on a section and a quarter east of Gravelton. He was not a careless man and not an unkind one, and he had known Silas Calhoun the way that men in a county know each other, by the accumulated impressions of 30 years of proximity without intimacy. He had formed no particular opinion of Silas's daughter except the general one that the county held, that she ran her farm competently, kept to herself, and had spent 35 cents on a crate of scrap iron at the pool sale when she was 9, which was remembered as an amusing footnote to her otherwise unremarkable existence. His lead-cutting horse had thrown 2 shoes and was moving unevenly on the left front. He had been waiting 7 weeks for the Carroll County farrier to fit him in. His wife had heard something at the dry goods store. He stood at the fence line of the Calhoun barn and watched Verity work. She had the horse in the cross ties in the barn aisle, a well-made quarter horse named Drum, who was communicating his unhappiness through a series of small movements that a less experienced person would have responded to with adjustment and accommodation. Verity did not adjust or accommodate. She moved with the horse the way the horse moved, not fighting him, not yielding to him, but maintaining a clear and constant expectation that the work was going to proceed, and it did. She cleaned the hoof with a pick and a brush, then assessed the angle with gauges she held against the wall of the hoof in 3 positions, noting the numbers without writing them down. She went to the shelf along the east wall and looked at her sorted stock for a moment before selecting a shoe. She held it against the hoof for comparison, marked it with chalk, carried it to the forge, and worked it with a precision that came from knowing exactly what she was starting with and exactly what she needed to arrive at. When the color was right, she set it on the anvil and made 3 corrections. The toe, a small adjustment at the left branch, the heel caulk on the right, in fewer strokes than Fletcher had expected, coming in under the metal rather than working against it. When she held it against the hoof the second time, it seated flat with no rocking. She nailed it with 7 nails, set the clenches with the clinching block, rasped the edge flush, and set the foot down. She moved to the second foot and did it again, and the second time went faster than the first because she had already learned this particular horse in the ways that mattered. Fletcher took his hat off when she finished. He rubbed the back of his neck with the brim, which was what he did when he was recalibrating something, and he looked at the horse and then at Verity and then at the horse again. The animal was standing square, weight distributed correctly, the minor shift in posture that comes when feet that have been wrong are finally right. You learned that from Silas, he said. From Silas and about 500 horseshoes, Verity said. He paid her $1.25. He drove home and told 3 men, one at the feed store, one at the cattle pens east of town, one at his own kitchen table, about what he had seen that morning. Not the story from the pool sale. That story they already knew. This was a different kind of story, the kind that moves through farming communities not because it is or strange, but because it is useful. The news that something you needed was available, delivered by a man who had seen it with his own eyes. The difference between those 2 types of stories, in the way they travel and the weight they carry when they arrive, is the difference between a community laughing and a community listening. Holt County had been laughing for 14 years. What Fletcher had to say that week required a different kind of attention, and some of the men who heard it gave it, and the ones who did started calling on Verity Calhoun before the spring work began in earnest. By the end of April, Verity had 8 regular customers. By July, she had 17. By the time the first frost came down out of the north in October of 1888, she was shoeing horses for 23 owners across 3 counties, and the work had developed its own rhythm. Certain farms on certain days, the route adjusted for weather, and the particular cycles of when horses needed attention. She kept the schedule in her head rather than on paper, not out of carelessness, but because the schedule was not complicated enough to require paper, and she preferred to save the ledger for numbers that actually needed recording. The money was modest by any measure that didn't account for what it had cost to generate. $1.25 a horse, multiplied by the horses she could reach in a day, minus the coal and nails and rasps that were her only real variable expenses. Some weeks, the farrier work brought in $4. Some weeks, when the route took her through 3 counties and the weather held, it was closer to 9. Added to what the wheat ground produced after harvest costs, she was putting between $350 and $400 a year into the Holt County Bank on top of the $1,200 Silas had left her, and she was doing it without a mortgage payment, without an equipment loan, without any of the carrying costs that made an equivalent income from a larger operation feel like significantly less. The men at the feed store in Gravelton had moved past the story about the pool sale by then, not because they had understood anything about what she was doing. Understanding it would have required them to connect a series of events that had been separated by enough years that the connections were not visible. But because the story had grown stale in the way that stories about children's inexplicable behavior grow stale. The child had grown up. The iron was gone from the conversation. What remained in the general accounting the community kept of its members was a woman who ran her father's farm and did horsework on the side, which was unremarkable enough to generate no particular attention. This suited Verity precisely. The shop was different now than it had been under Silas. Not structurally. She had changed nothing about the building or the bench or the arrangement of tools on the wall, but in the quality of activity it contained. Silas had used it for everything, the general repair and fabrication work that a farm generates in endless quantity. Verity used it for everything too, but she had also given it a second function, and that function was beginning to define the space, as surely as the forge defined the southeast corner. The east wall with its sorted horseshoe inventory had been a project when she was a child. Now it was an operational asset, and the distinction was visible in how she moved through the room. She had also begun to learn things that Emmett Prawl had not taught her, because Emmett Prawl had been a farrier and not a horse doctor, and the line between those two disciplines was less distinct in practice than it was in theory. Horses that needed shoes regularly had feet that told stories, and the longer she worked, the better she became at reading those stories. An angle that was slightly off, a flare in the wall that indicated uneven loading, the subtle asymmetry in how a horse shifted its weight when you picked up one foot versus another. These things were not in any book she had read, because the books available to her were general agricultural texts that treat farrier as a mechanical procedure rather than a diagnostic one. What she was learning from the horses, in the particular way that skills develop when the practitioner is paying the right kind of attention. The winter of 1890 arrived early and with conviction. By the first week of December, the ground was frozen to a depth that made the wheat fields ring when you walked on them, and the mornings had the iron quality of cold that is not going to be negotiated with. Verity had adjusted her route for the season, concentrating work in the earlier part of the week when she could use daylight more efficiently and leaving the later days for the shop work that could be done by lantern without significant penalty. On a Thursday in early December, she drove to the Goss place. Fletcher's cutting horse, a rangy sorrel named Captain that was the best-made animal on the operation, and the one Fletcher rode every day, without exception, had come due for new shoes, and Verity had been working him for 2 years by then. She knew the horse's feet well enough that she had stopped measuring things she had once measured because the information no longer varied enough to matter. That familiarity was the problem, though she did not understand it yet. The mistake she made was small. Afternoon light in Missouri in early December lasts until about 4:30 and is useful only until 4, and she had pushed her morning work longer than she should have. And by the time she got to the Goss barn, the light coming through the west-facing doors was the flat, diffuse gray of late winter afternoon. Not dark, not dim exactly, but without the directional quality that allowed her to read shadows correctly. She assessed the angle of Captain's left hind with the gauges, made her note, selected her shoe, worked it to fit. She nailed it. She set the clinches. She moved on. 3 weeks later, Fletcher Goss came to the Calhoun place on a Monday morning and hitched his horse at the fence post near the shop door. Verity heard the horse and came out. Fletcher did not raise his voice. That was the thing about the moment that she registered most clearly in the years afterward, that he came to her without anger, which would have been easier to process than what he actually brought. He was a man who kept his expression under tight management, and he was managing it now, but what showed underneath the management was something quieter and worse than anger. He had put 3 years of goodwill into recommending her work. He had told men she trusted, men whose opinions of her he had shaped before she ever walked onto their property. Captain had been going uneven for 4 days, and yesterday the horse was clearly lame on the left hind. And Fletcher had looked at the foot himself the previous evening and had enough experience around horses to know that the shoe was sitting wrong. Verity did not make excuses. She did not explain the light or the schedule or the way the afternoon had gone. "Let me see him," she said. She went to the Goss barn with Fletcher, and she looked at the foot and she looked at the shoe, and she understood immediately what had happened, because the error was visible now in a way it had not been visible in the gray light of a December afternoon. 2 degrees of roll in the heel caulk, enough to distribute the loading incorrectly across the coffin joint, enough that 3 weeks of daily work had inflamed the tissue inside the hoof wall in the way that incorrect loading always eventually does. 9 of her 32 regular customers canceled in the 2 weeks that followed. The cancellations came in the particular way. Bad news travels through a close community, not through any organized campaign, but through the organic circulation of information among people who talk to each other at the feed store, the cattle pens, the dry goods counter. The story that moved was not technical. Nobody explained coffin joints or heel caulk angles. What people said was that the Calhoun woman had lamed Fletcher Goss's best horse, and what they remembered in the context of that information was the pool sale and the 35 cents and the original error of investing confidence in someone who had started by buying scrap iron. The community had revised its opinion of Verity twice already, once for the worse when she bought the iron, once for the better when Fletcher came back from her barn in the spring of 1888. Now it was revising again, and the revision was faster and more thorough than either of the previous ones, because that is the nature of revision in the negative direction. A woman doing a man's work in a community that had accepted her doing it because the results had been good is always one significant failure away from hearing the version of events that was being held in reserve. Verity heard it. She kept working. And what she did about Fletcher's horse was not small, and she did not do it because she thought it would repair her reputation. She did it because the horse was her mistake, and the horse needed to be fixed. And those 2 facts together pointed toward one course of action that she could see clearly enough that the question perceived was not the first question. She went to the Goss farm the morning after Fletcher's visit and told him what she intended to do. She pulled the shoe. She soaked the foot in a warm solution she had read about in an agricultural journal and tested on her own horses when they showed early inflammation. Salt and a small amount of a drawing compound that was available at the Gravelton apothecary. She wrapped the hoof with cloth packing and a protective boot she had made herself from a piece of leather and a length of wide harness strap. Then she came back the next day and did it again. She came back every morning for 3 weeks. The distance from the Calhoun place to the Goss barn was 5 miles, and she drove it in the wagon before breakfast, worked the horse's foot for 40 minutes, and drove back. On the days when the temperature was below 15 degrees, which happened 4 times during those 3 weeks, she sat in Fletcher's barn, while the soaking solution was working, and thought about angles. She thought about the specific relationship between the heel caulk and the coffin joint, about what the correct angle looked like in good light versus in the gray light of a west-facing barn door in December, about what she had been measuring and what she had been assuming, and where the gap between those 2 things had opened up without her noticing. On the 12th day, she brought a new shoe she had made in the shop the previous evening. It was not a standard shoe. She had made a modification, a slight asymmetry in the branch, a deliberate adjustment to the heel that would compensate not only for the damage the incorrect loading had caused, but for a structural tendency in the hoof wall she had been noting for 2 years without acting on because it had not, until now, been severe enough to require intervention. She had been watching this foot long enough to know it. She had the information. She had simply been making a different shoe than the foot needed, because the foot had been tolerating a near-correct shoe well enough that the gap had not announced itself. She nailed the new shoe on the 14th morning. The horse walked out of the cross ties on the 15th morning with an evenness that Fletcher had not seen from him in years. Not just recovered, but corrected. The underlying asymmetry addressed rather than worked around. Fletcher stood in the barn aisle and watched Captain walk away from him and watched him walk back. He was not a man who displayed his inner states in ways that were easy to read. But he looked at the horse for a long time, and then he looked at Verity, and what passed across his face was not the simple relief of a problem resolved. It was the specific recognition of a person who has watched someone absorb a failure, refuse to explain it away, and come back with something better than what existed before the failure occurred. He said nothing. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a man arriving at a conclusion he intended to keep. 6 of the 9 customers who had canceled came back within the following month. 3 did not, and she understood this as the permanent cost of the error rather than a problem to be solved, and she entered it in the ledger she kept in her head as a number with 2 values. What she had lost, and what she had learned that she would not have learned any other way. What she had learned was the modification technique. It was not something she had read anywhere or been taught by anyone. It was the product of having made an error, having corrected the error with insufficient tools, having been forced to think more carefully than she had previously thought about the relationship between the hoof's existing structure and the shoe's job of redirecting force. In the 6 months following the Goss incident, she applied the technique to 4 other horses in her care, not because they were lame, but because she could see in their movement patterns and their hoof geometry the same kind of slow imbalance that, left unaddressed, would eventually become the thing she had accidentally caused in Fletcher's horse. In each case, the modification produced a visible improvement that the horse's owner could observe without being told what to look for. Word of this moved more slowly than the word about Captain's lameness had moved. Useful information, in farming communities, travels along the lines of who needs it, which is a narrower channel than scandal. But it traveled, and the people who needed it found it. And by the spring of 1891, she had more than replaced the 9 customers she had lost and was working horses for 37 owners across 4 counties. Lottie arrived that summer. Ord's daughter was 11 years old and looked, with enough precision to be briefly disorienting, like the version of Ord that had existed before Ord decided he was better suited to city work than farm work. She had his coloring and his particular way of arriving somewhere and immediately assessing it from multiple angles before committing to an approach, which in Ord expressed itself as urban wariness, but in Lottie registered as curiosity, uncorrupted by apprehension. Ord had sent her on the train from Kansas City with a note that said she needed a summer in the country and that he trusted Verity's judgment about what that meant. The note was characteristically brief, Ord having never been a man who found letters an efficient use of his time. Lottie came to the shop the morning after she arrived, before breakfast, before Verity had come out of the house. When Verity walked through the shop door, at 5:30, she found her niece standing at the east wall looking at the sorted horseshoe inventory with the focused attention of someone reading a document rather than inspecting an object. Verity stood in the doorway and looked at the girl, and then at the shelf and back at the girl. "What are you looking at?" she said. Lottie turned. "The categories. Why are these 3 different from those 3? Verity walked to the shelf and looked at the section the girl was pointing at. The question was not general. It was about a specific distinction in the sorting, a subdivision within the medium stock that most people would not have noticed as a subdivision at all. She explained it, the nail hole placement, the way a particular style of punching indicated a certain period and region of manufacture, what that told you about the iron's probable carbon content before you even put it near the forge. Lottie listened the way she had looked at the shelf, with the total attention that some children are born with and others never develop regardless of instruction. When Verity finished, the girl said, "How do you know when the carbon content matters?" That conversation lasted until after sunrise. They had breakfast late. By the 3rd week of July, Lottie was in the shop before Verity every morning. By August, she had a working knowledge of the drill press, the hand crank grinding wheel, and the basic mechanics of the forge blower that Verity had not explicitly taught her, because Lottie had simply watched and then tried and then adjusted, which was how the shop had always transmitted its knowledge. Verity gave her a piece of mild steel stock and showed her how to cut it and told her to make something with a right angle without specifying any further. She came back 2 hours later to find that Lottie had made a bracket with a right angle and had also made a second one because the first one had not satisfied her, which was exactly the right reason to make a second one. The girl had it. The same eye, the same unwillingness to accept a result that was close but not correct, the same instinct for the difference between what a piece of metal wanted to do and what it needed to be made to do. Verity noted this and adjusted her approach accordingly, which meant expecting more and explaining less, because the expectation was more useful than the explanation when someone was already doing the right thing. Lottie went back to Kansas City in September when the school term started. She came back the following summer and the summer after that. By the time she was 13, she was firing the forge herself, which Verity watched from the doorway with a feeling she recognized as something adjacent to pride but more specifically calibrated. Not general admiration of the girl's capability, but the particular satisfaction of watching a way of working pass from one generation to the next without losing anything essential in the transit. Meanwhile, out beyond the perimeter of the Calhoun place, Holt County was doing what every farming county in Missouri was doing in the late 1880s and early 1890s, which was proceeding on the assumption that conditions would continue to improve because they had been improving. The railroad had extended its reach into the county in 1887, which had changed the economics of getting grain to market and had also, less visibly, changed the psychology of expansion. The sense that the infrastructure of permanence was arriving, that what had been frontier was becoming established, that the appropriate response to establishment was investment at scale. Land prices had been climbing since 1885. Corn had been strong. Wheat had been strong. The men who had borrowed to buy additional acreage in 1886 and 1887 had by 1889 and 1890 the particular confidence of people whose bets have been paying off long enough that the bets no longer feel like bets. The Holt County Bank on Gravelton's Main Street had grown in ways that were visible from the outside. A second teller window had been installed. A new front door of better wood. The president of the bank, a man named Aldous Hester, had begun wearing a different quality of suits sometime around 1889, and the quality of the suit was one of those small data points that Verity registered without particularly intending to, the way she registered everything, as information about conditions, without sentiment. She watched what was happening at the Calhoun place with the same neutral attention she gave to weather. She was not immune to the appeal of the logic. The arithmetic of expansion made a certain kind of sense if you were willing to accept its premises, and the premises had been generating accurate predictions long enough that people had stopped treating them as premises and started treating them as facts. She understood this. What she did not do was participated in it, not out of superior wisdom or prophetic ability, but because the thing she had inherited from Silas, the thing that had been in his bones and was now in hers, was an allergic response to any arithmetic that required the future to perform as expected in order to make the present work. By the close of 1892, her account at the Holt County Bank, $4,100. The farm was paid for. The shop equipment was paid for. The wagon was paid for. Her expenses were coal, nails, rasps, wheat seed, fuel for the wagon lamp and the house stove, and the property tax on 280 acres. And they came to nearly the same number every year within 2 or 3% because she had built her operation so that nothing in it could change without her deciding to change it. There was nothing variable she hadn't accounted for. There was nothing borrowed that could be called. The winter of 1892 was the last ordinary winter for some time. The panic of 1893 began in the way that financial collapses generally begin, not all at once, but in a sequence of events that seemed, at each step, like isolated problems rather than the leading edge of a systemic failure. Several large railroads went into receivership in the spring. Banks that lent optimistic land valuations began to feel the pressure of notes that had been written when the valuations were higher than the collateral that secured them. Credit tightened in the way that credit tightens when the institutions that extend it become uncertain. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, but in the ordinary daily texture of loan applications that did not proceed and renewals that came back with different terms. By the summer of 1893, the tightening was evident in Holt County in specific ways. The implement dealer on the south end of Gravelton's Main Street sold fewer pieces of equipment in 6 months than he had sold in the previous 2 years combined. The bank's new teller window was, by October, operating without a teller. Aldous Hester wore the good suit less frequently, which was the kind of indicator that most people did not notice, and Verity did. What she noticed more was the quality of the conversations at the feed store and the goods counter. The shift in register from the expansive talk of men discussing what they intended to build to the more careful talk of men discussing how to manage what they already had. The confidence that had been in the air for nearly a decade was not gone, exactly, but it had changed texture, and the texture it had changed to was recognizable to anyone who had been around working farms long enough to know the difference between a man who has margin and a man who is hoping the season turns before the payment comes due. Fletcher Goss came to the Calhoun place in February of 1894 on a weekday morning, which was unusual enough that Verity came to the door before he reached it. Having heard his wagon in the yard and already understanding, from the time of day and the purposefulness of his approach, that this was not a horse call. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hands, not the way he had stood in the yard in the winters he had come for captain. That posture had been the posture of a man arriving with a practical problem. This was the posture of a man delivering information he would have preferred not to deliver. He had lost the east half of his section. The note had been written in the spring of 1889, at the suggestion of the bank, to finance the purchase of a second mowing machine and a grain drill that the farm could, at 1889 prices and in 1889 yields, have supported without significant difficulty. By the terms of the note as restructured in 1893, the payment that came due in January of 1894 required either cash the operation did not have or collateral that was now worth less than the loan. He had given the bank the east 80 acres. The bank had taken them. He was not asking for anything. He was telling her because she had been Farrier 6 years for 6, and because he was a man who believed that the people who had been doing business with you deserved to hear significant news directly rather than from someone at the feed store. He was also, she understood from the way he was standing, a man who had been thinking for several months about the sequence of decisions that had produced this outcome, and who had arrived at conclusions that he was not entirely comfortable with. A man can do everything right by the measure his neighbor uses, he said, and the neighbor's measure can turn out to be wrong. Verity stood in the doorway of the house and looked at him for a moment before she said anything. The neighbor's measure is usually right, she said, until it isn't. The problem is that when it stops being right, it stops all at once. Fletcher turned his hat over once in his hands, the brim going through his fingers without him looking at it. He had known the situation was coming for months before it arrived, he said back. He had seen the numbers and understood what they meant, and he had hoped the numbers would change. She asked him what he had done about the hope, and he was quiet for long enough that the silence was its own answer. She did not tell him what she thought about the decisions he had made in 1889. That was not information he needed from her, and in any case he had clearly been providing it to himself with some thoroughness over the preceding months. She said she was sorry about the East Ground, and she meant it, and she told him she would be out at the beginning of March for Captain's shoes, and she would see him then. After he drove out, she went to the shop and stood at the bench for a while without working. Through the east-facing window, she could see the upper corner of the Stritch place across the property line, the top of the Stritch barn roof, the bare cottonwoods along Stritch's fence line. She knew those fields. She had walked that property line with her father when she was 12 years old, helping him establish the survey corner markers that the county required after a boundary dispute between two neighbors, 2 properties over, had prompted everyone in the area to verify their own lines. The Stritch land was good ground, flatter than the Calhoun fields, with a heavier topsoil and better drainage on the west end, and the well in the northeast corner that her father had spent 3 days helping Ira Stritch's father drill in 1865. Olin Stritch was Ira's son. He had inherited the farm in 1879 and had farmed it with the same middling competence that had characterized Ira's operation. Not badly, not particularly well, in the way of men who treat farming as something that happens to them rather than something they are actively directing. He had borrowed money in 1888 to replace his wagon team and put up a new equipment shed, and he had borrowed again in 1891 when a late spring frost killed 2/3 of his wheat stand, and he needed operating money to replant. Verity did not know the exact figures on his debt. She had seen enough of the Stritch farm across the fence line to know she didn't need to. The incremental deterioration was visible from the road, fence posts not replaced, equipment sitting outside through the winter that should have been under cover, fieldwork that ran behind in ways that accumulated seasonally. It was the look of a farm carrying more than it could comfortably manage, and she had been reading that look for years. What she did not do was speculate about what she was going to do about it. She went back to work. The foreclosure notices in Holt County came through the sheriff's office and were posted publicly, which meant anyone paying attention had 2 to 3 months of visible warning before a property went to auction. Between the summer of 1893 and the summer of 1895, 9 farms in Holt County went to foreclosure auction. She did not bid on any of them. 3 were too far from the Calhoun property to add operational value. 2 came at prices that cleared quickly before she could assess whether they were right. The remaining 4 were ground she looked at carefully and decided against, either because the soil profile was weaker than it appeared on casual inspection, or because the infrastructure improvements acquired brought the real acquisition cost above what she was willing to commit. She was willing to commit a specific amount. She had calculated it and recalculated it several times across 1894 and into 1895, each time starting from the same data: her account balance, her annual income from the Farrier work in the wheat ground, her fixed costs, the minimum reserve she was not willing to fall below under any circumstances. The number she arrived at was not the maximum she could spend. It was the maximum she could spend and still be, the following morning, in the same fundamental position she had been in for the past 8 years. No debt, adequate reserve, expenses covered by income without strain. The Stritch notice went up in the first week of August 1895. She read it at the post office in Gravelton on a Thursday morning, standing in the entryway with the notice in her hand. 160 acres, boundary descriptions she could recite it without reading them. Auction to be conducted on the second Tuesday of October. Opening bid to be established by the Holt County Bank. She folded the notice and put it in her coat pocket and walked to the bank. Aldous Hester received her in his office. He had the look of a man who had spent 2 years managing a situation he had helped create and was not at peace with either the situation or his role in it. He told her the opening bid would be set at $22 an acre, which was the bank's calculation of the minimum figure that would satisfy the outstanding obligation on the stretch note. He also told her, with the careful neutrality of a banker conducting a legal proceeding, that he expected competitive interest from outside the county. She thanked him and left. On the first Monday of October, she drove to the bank and asked the teller to confirm her account balance. The teller, a young man named Hollis, who had been working the window for 3 years and knew her deposits the way tellers know the patterns of customers who come in regularly, wrote the number on a slip of paper and slid it across the counter without being asked to. The balance was $5,350. She looked at the number for a moment, then folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket alongside the notice she had been carrying since August. She drove home. She spent the 9 days between the bank visit and the auction in the ordinary operations of the farm and the Farrier route, which meant that she thought about the auction the way she thought about most things, in the background, where it ran without interrupting whatever she was actually doing, producing occasional conclusions that she noted and set aside until the situation required them. She was not nervous in the way that word is usually meant. What she felt was something closer to the concentrated alertness she had at the beginning of a difficult Farrier job, a clear sense of what result she was trying to produce, without sentiment about the process. She was not going to overpay. The ground was worth a specific number to her, a number she would derive from what it would produce in wheat at current prices, adjusted for the improvement value of the irrigation well that already existed in the northeast corner, adjusted again for what it meant to farm land that was contiguous with land she already owned. The number she had arrived at was $28 an acre. Below that, the ground was a good acquisition. Above it, she was paying for something other than what the ground was actually worth to her, and she had not done that with 35 cents in 1874, and she was not going to do it with $4,490 in 1895. She arrived at the Stritch place on the second Tuesday of October at 8:15 in the morning, 45 minutes before the auction was scheduled to begin. The sky was the particular pale blue of an October morning that has decided to be honest about being autumn, and the frost on the Stritch fields was burning off from the east in the way that frost burns when the sun has enough angle to reach it, but not enough heat to hurry. She did not recognize the man from Springfield immediately. He came in a good wagon with a matched team, the kind of conspicuous equipment choice that announced itself, and he had the particular quality of alertness that men who move through multiple distressed property auctions develop. His name, she would learn later, was Carver Dunn, and he had been working the foreclosure circuit through western Missouri since the spring of 1893. Fletcher was there. He stood near the back of the group that had assembled along the fence line of the yard, and he looked like a man who had come because not coming would have been worse, which was probably the accurate description of his reasoning. She did not go to him. The appropriate thing, she understood, was to let him be where he had decided to be. Hamp Rudd arrived at 8:50 and conducted the legal preliminaries with the efficiency of long practice. He read the property description. He read the conditions of sale. He set the opening bid at $22 an acre. Carver Dunn opened at $22. The farmer from the county to the north, a man she did not know by name, who had driven 40 miles for the opportunity, went to $23.50. Carver Dunn went to $25. Verity said $28. The silence that followed was the kind of silence she had been expecting, though expecting it did not diminish it. It settled over the yard the way the frost had settled on the fields 2 hours earlier, not dramatic, not loud, but total in its own way, the silence of a collective pause that had no pretense in it. The people who had been standing in small groups turned. The people who had been looking at the ground looked up. Carver Dunn, standing 12 feet to her left, turned and looked at her with an expression that was doing the arithmetic she had already done, arriving at the conclusion she had already arrived at, and recognizing that the number she had said was a number he was not going to chase. Hamp Rudd said, "Do I hear 29? The cold morning air moved through the yard. The cottonwoods along the fence line made their small, dry sound. Carver Dunn's match team shifted their weight with the particular patience of horses who have learned that waiting is most of the job. Nobody said 29. Hamp Rudd sold 160 acres, $28 per acre, to Miss Verity Calhoun of Holt County. She walked to the table Hamp had set up near the door of the Stritch house, signed the transfer papers with the pen Hamp offered, and wrote the check on the Holt bank account in the amount of $4,480. Hamp Rudd received it with the practiced neutrality of a man who has accepted checks at county auctions for 20 years and does not allow himself opinions about the size of them. The farmer from the North County stood near the table a moment after the papers were signed. He looked like a man working out whether to say something, then decided to say it. And what he said was that he had known her father. Most people did, Verity said. He looked at the ground they were standing on, Silas would have liked this. She handed the last signed page back to Hamp Rudd and looked up. Her father had known she would do this, she said. She had simply needed to wait for the price to come down. Fletcher Goss was still at the fence line when she finished with the papers. He had not moved to his wagon yet. She walked to where he was standing, and for a moment they were both looking at the same ground. The 160 acres that had been the subject of a specific kind of silence between them all morning. He did not look at her immediately. He was a man who processed things at his own pace, and she had always respected that about him. When he finally turned, his expression had the quality of something that had been thought through to its conclusion. A person can watch something for years, he said, and still not see it until they're standing in the right place. She looked at the field. The frost was gone from it now, the ground showing the particular dark brown of good Missouri wheat soil in October, promising in the specific way that good ground is always promising when it hasn't yet been asked to deliver. My father used to say that the ground doesn't care who holds the deed, she said. It only responds to what you put into it. Fletcher picked up his hat from the fence post where he had set it and settled it on his head with the deliberate motion of a man preparing to move on. He looked at her once more, the slow, assessing look of a man who has revised his understanding of his situation and wants to fix the revision accurately before he leaves. He drove out the east road without further comment, and she stood at the fence line for a while after his wagon disappeared, looking at the ground that was now hers on both sides of the wire. The story that came out of the Stritch auction moved through Holt County slowly, in the particular way that information moves, when its passage requires people to reckon with something uncomfortable about their own position. It was not told with the easy warmth of the story from 1874. At every stop it was told with a quality of precision the original story had never required. Specific numbers, specific dates, the names of the other bidders, the sound of the silence after she said $28. People were not laughing. They were trying to understand something, and understanding it required admitting certain things about what they had been watching for 20 years without watching correctly. The winter of 1895 was hard in the practical sense. Temperature, snowfall, the particular punishment that a Missouri January inflicts on anyone who has outdoor work that cannot be postponed. Verity ran her Farrier route on the days when the roads allowed it, and spent the days when they didn't in the shop. The new ground was sitting under snow to the east, visible from the shop's east window as a white field broken only by the fence line she now owned on both sides. She had walked it twice before the first hard freeze, covering the 160 acres on foot over 2 mornings, reading the soil where the frost had not yet locked it, and checking the wonky in the CH corner, and mapping in her head the adjustments she would make to the field rotation and the drainage patterns when spring came. The well was in better condition than she had expected. Her father had helped drill it 30 years ago, and the casing was limestone set in the way that the good wells of that period were set, built to last rather than built to minimum standard. She ran her hand along the casing and felt the workmanship in it, the same quality she recognized in her spa bench and his forge installation and every other piece of work he had done that she had encountered over the course of her life. He had been dead for 8 years, and she was still finding his work in the world and recognizing it. She added 160 acres to her wheat rotation the following spring. The ground that had been the Stritch farm required more attention than the Calhoun fields in its first season under her management. The previous decade of uneven farming had let certain soil conditions develop that she had to address deliberately rather than simply plan around. She tiled one low section in the southwest corner that had been holding water long enough to compact the subsoil. She fallowed 20 acres on the east end and put them in clover for a season rather than push a wheat crop through ground that was not ready for it. These decisions cost her some first-year production but produced, over the following 2 seasons, a yield per acre on the new ground that exceeded what the Stritch farm had produced in any of the previous 10 years for which she could find records. The Holt County bank account, which had stood at $870 after the purchase, the working reserve she had refused to spend below, was back to $2,200 by the close of 1896, built back through the Farrier work and the first wheat harvest from her original ground while the new acreage was still being corrected. By the close of 1897, it was $3,800. By the close of 1898, it was past $5,000 for the first time, the new ground now producing its corrected rate, the Farrier route running 41 horses across 4 counties, with a waiting list she managed by geography rather than chronology. Fletcher Goss had reorganized his operation around the 80 acres he still owned outright, having lost the east half to the bank in the winter of 1894. He was farming smaller, and farming smaller suited him in a way that farming larger had not, which was the kind of thing a man learned about himself at a cost. Verity thought was too high for the lesson, though she did not say this to him. He still had Captain, working now with the economy of a well-made horse in its prime, and Verity still shot him every 6 weeks on the Tuesday route, and the Tuesday route through the Goss place had the quality of a long conversation that neither of them was having out loud. In the spring of 1899, on one of those Tuesdays, Fletcher asked her how the new ground was coming. Better than it had any right to, the first 2 seasons, she said. Now it's coming as it should. He was quiet for a moment watching her work, the second shoe. The barn was warm enough that the work was comfortable, which, in Missouri in April, meant the season had turned for real. He said, I look at that ground from my fence line sometimes. She pulled the nail set from her apron pocket. What do you think when you look at it? I think it looks like it always looked, he said. I think that's what bothers me. She drove the nail and set the clinch and didn't say anything. Because what he had just said was true, and adding to it would have been less useful than letting it sit. The ground looked the same from the outside as it always had. The difference was in what was happening inside it, in the tiling and the fallowing and the rotation decisions that weren't visible from a fence line, and in who held the deed. Fletcher knew all of this. He had said what he said because he needed to say it once, not because he expected a response. She finished the second foot and let it down and stood up, and he handed her the money without being asked, and she took it without counting it, because she had never needed to count his money. Lottie was 19 that summer. She came in June as she always did, on the train from Kansas City, with a bag that was heavier than the previous summers because her interests had expanded, and her interests tended to produce physical objects. This summer the bag contained, among other things, a notebook she had been keeping since January in which she had written down every question she had about metalworking that she hadn't been able to answer from the books available to her in Kansas City. The notebook had 41 pages of questions. Verity read through it on the first evening while Lottie was in the bath. The questions were not the questions of a beginner. They were the questions of someone who had been working at the edge of their knowledge long enough to map the boundary precisely. Some of them Verity could answer directly. Several were questions she had asked herself and arrived at working answers for through trial rather than any formal instruction. 2 of them were questions she had not considered, which was the quality in the girl that Verity found most useful and most difficult to hunt for, the angle of approach, a practical approach that came from having thought about the same material from a position outside the shop, without the habits of practice that could make the familiar invisible. She answered the questions she could answer over the first 2 weeks in the shop, with the work itself as the medium of instruction. The ones that required demonstration she demonstrated. The ones that required a fabricated example she fabricated alongside Lottie, which was not how Silas had taught her. Silas had fabricated, and she watched. But Lottie at 19 was not absorbing a primary education. She was refining a secondary one, and the instruction that fit that stage was different. The 2 questions Verity had not considered stayed with her longer. One was about stress distribution in a modified shoe, specifically whether the asymmetric modification she used for corrective work redistributed load in ways that had secondary effects on the hoof wall above the shoe's contact surface. She had not measured this because she had not had a way to measure it, and the horses she had worked with had not shown problems in the relevant area. But the question once asked changed what she looked for when she assessed her corrective cases, and over the following year she found enough instances of the secondary effect, subtle, not harmful, but present, that she adjusted her modification technique twice to account for it. The second question she sat with for 3 years before she understood what it was actually asking. That same summer produced the first significant disruption to the Farrier route since the Goss incident 9 years earlier. A man named Reuben Farr, who ran a small cattle operation 8 miles northeast of Gravelton and who had been a customer since 1890, told her in July that he was switching to a farrier who had recently relocated to Holt County from St. Joseph. The new man had a wagon-mounted forge setup and was offering services at $1 flat per horse, which was 25 cents below Verity's rate. Reuben said this without apology but also without comfort, and she understood from his manner that the price was not the only factor, that there was something in the situation that made using the new man feel like the main thing for a man who employed men and himself employed within a community of men. She did not argue with him. She said she hoped the work suited him and drove on to her next stop. The new farrier, his name was Pierce Hollowell, and he had worked in St. Joseph for 4 years before the work dried up and he followed a cousin to Woolton County, ran his wagon-mounted operation for 14 months. He had the equipment but not the full range of skills the equipment implied, and the gap between those two things showed first in his corrective cases, then in his routine work, and then in the form of a horse in the Gravelton livery stable that went seriously lame in the fall of 1900 after 6 months of Hollowell's shoeing. Reuben Farr came back to her in November of that year, with the directness of a man who has reached a conclusion he would have preferred not to reach and intends to deal with it efficiently. She took his horses back at the same rate she had always charged, and did not refer to the intervening 14 months except to note, when she assessed his lead horse, that the front feet needed more correction than usual, and it would take 2 shoeings to get them right. "That's fine," Reuben said. She heard in those 2 words the specific weight of a man paying a price he had brought on himself, and she did not make it heavier. Pierce Hollowell left Holt County in the spring of 1901. She did not know where he went and did not seek the information. Lottie turned 20 in October of 1900 and came for the Christmas school break that year in addition to the summer, which was the first indication that the pull of the farm had changed from seasonal interest to something with more gravity in it. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late December and was in the shop before supper, not because Verity had suggested it, but because where else would she be? The shop in December had the quality it always had in winter, the wood stove making the limestone walls hold heat better than the house wall did, the lantern light creating a working circle against the dark outside the small windows, the smell of coal and iron and linseed oil. That was the smell of this room and no other room Lottie had ever been in. Verity was working a piece of stock at the bench when Lottie came in. She did not interrupt her own work, and Lottie did not require interruption. She came in, assessed what was happening at the bench, and went to the east wall to look at the horseshoe inventory, which she did every time she arrived after an absence, checking it the way a person checks a collection they have been thinking about in the interval. "There are more in this section than there were in June," Lottie said. Verity finished the cut she was making. "Estate sale in September. Farm northeast of Mound City, family with no one left to take the land. 3 crates in the equipment shed, nobody wanted them." "How much?" 40 cents for everything in the shed. The shoes came to somewhere above 200. Lottie turned and looked at her. 200 shoes for 40 cents. The man running the sale wanted the crates back. Lottie turned back to the shelf. She stood there for a long moment in the way she always stood when she was working something through. Still, weight distributed evenly, the notebook nowhere in evidence, because this was not the kind of thinking that required external recording. Then she said, "People are still walking past them." 26 years on, Verity said, "and it has not changed." Lottie came every summer and every winter break after that, and when she ceased her schooling in Kansas City in the spring of 1902, she came to Holt County and did not go back. Ord came down in June to discuss it and stayed 2 days and drove back to Kansas City with the expression of a man who has lost an argument he expected to win. Lottie was 22 years old and not asking permission, which was the Calhoun disposition in all its forms. The particular confidence of people who have calculated the situation accurately enough that they do not need to consult the opinions of people who haven't. What the transition looked like in practical terms was not a handover but a parallel running. The 2 of them in the shop together, on the farm together, on the Farrier route together, in the way that the operation had always been built to accommodate a second pair of hands. Verity moved certain pieces of the field work to Lottie and watched her manage them, then moved more when the management was correct, then moved more still. The same process, the same deliberate sequence of trust and verification that Silas had used when Verity was young enough that trust needed to be built incrementally. Lottie approached the wheat ground differently than Verity did. Not worse, differently, with the eye of someone who had been looking at it from outside the daily familiarity of long ownership and could therefore see patterns that proximity had made invisible. She identified a drainage problem on the north end of the original Calhoun fields in her first fall on the ground full-time, a problem that Verity had been addressing symptomatically for years without tracing it to its actual cause. Lottie traced it in 2 days of walking the field after a hard rain, found the impermeable clay layer that was intercepting subsurface flow, and proposed a tiles solution that was more extensive than anything Verity had done before. Verity looked at the plan for 2 days. Then she said, "Do it." They tiled the north end in the fall of 1902, working themselves with hired labor for the trench cutting. On the following spring, the north field produced at a rate that surprised Verity, which was not something that happened often. She stood at the edge of the north field in June of 1903 and looked at the stand of wheat, and then looked at Lottie standing beside her. "Your grandfather would have found that problem in 1878, Verity said. Lottie looked at the field. "Maybe, but he was inside it. You have to be outside something to see what it's doing." That was the second question from the notebook, the one that had taken 3 years. Not a question about metalworking at all, as it turned out. A question about what happened to your understanding of a system when you were inside it long enough that the system's assumptions became your own. Verity stood with that knowledge for a moment, and then filed it where she filed things that were true and useful, somewhere close to the surface where it would be available the next time she needed it. In the summer of 1903, Verity began the formal transfer of operational authority. Not the farm itself, that would come in its proper time, through the instruments that her father's lawyer in Gravelton had drawn up, and that she had updated twice since inheriting the property. What she transferred in 1903 was the daily management, the fair scheduling, the wheat rotation decisions, the equipment maintenance calendar, the relationship with Aldous Hester's successor at the Holt County Bank, a younger man named Graves who had the intelligence to understand that the Calhoun account was something unusual and the sense not to treat it as an invitation to suggest products. Lottie took these responsibilities the way she took all responsibilities, without ceremony and without the performance of gratitude, which was correct, because what was being transferred was not a gift but a recognition. It had been earned through 4 years of parallel work, and a decade before that of summers and winter breaks, and 41 pages of questions in a notebook. Verity had not been waiting for Lottie to be ready. She had been waiting for the transfer to be accurate, for the thing being handed over to match the capacity receiving it. By the summer of 1903, the match was exact. What Verity kept was the shop. Not exclusively, Lottie worked in it as she always had, and the shop was as much hers as the field was, and more hers than the kitchen, which neither of them had ever treated as anything other than a necessary room. But Verity kept the shop in the sense that she kept its character, its inventory, its institutional memory. She was the one who knew where every tool had come from and what it had cost and what condition it had been in when it arrived and how it had been brought to its current state. She was the one who knew the history of every section of the East Wall Horseshoe inventory, which crate had come from, which sale, which shoes had been acquired in 1876, and which in 1894, and which in the September estate sale north of Mound City. This knowledge was not transferable in any efficient sense. It lived in the specific combination of experience and time that could not be summarized without losing most of what made it useful. She was 41 years old. She did not think of herself as old, because she was not old by any reasonable measure, but she was aware that the bending work, the sustained crouching over a horse's foot that the Farrier job required, the specific combination of flexion and torque that became cumulative in joints that had been performing it for 15 years, was a cost that had been accruing silently and was now beginning to present itself for accounting. She did not stop the work, she reduced it. By the fall of 1903, she was running 20 horses herself, the ones within the tightest radius of the farm, and Lottie had absorbed the rest of the route with the efficient competence of someone who had been watching the work done correctly for years before doing it herself. One morning in October of 1903, Lottie fired the forge while Verity was still in the house. When Verity came to the shop with 2 cups of coffee, she stood in the doorway for a moment before going in. The forge was going. The coal smell and the heat and the particular sound of the hand blower moving air through the hearth, all of it the same as it had been every morning since 1851, when the forge had come into that corner for the first time and the limestone walls had been built around it. Lottie was working a piece of stock at the anvil, not a shoe, a bracket for something, some farm purpose that Verity would learn about later. The movements were confident without hurry, reading the color the way the color needed to be read. Verity set one coffee cup on the corner of the bench and held the other and stood in the doorway and watched. She did not speak because there was nothing to say, and she did not go to the bench because Lottie did not need her at the bench. What she was watching was not a student. What she was watching was the next version of what she herself had been, the way of seeing that her father had given her, now present in this room in a second form. Complete for having passed through the intermediate stage of her own life to get there. Fletcher Goss came by that October, not for Captain. Captain was now retired from the cutting work and living out his remaining years on the Kostpieter with the dignity appropriate to a horse who had been worked well and respected, but to drop off a fence post auger he had borrowed in the spring and kept meaning to return. He found Verity in the yard rather than the shop, walking the perimeter of the east field where it bordered what had been the stritch ground. He left the auger on the fence post near the shop door and came to where she was standing. "The wheat looks good," he said. "It does," she said. "The south section on the new ground is coming better than I expected." He looked out across the field. She looked at it too, both of them looking at the same ground that had been the subject of a specific silence between them for 8 years. "You're going to leave this place in better shape than you found it," Fletcher said. "It was already in good shape," she said. "My grandfather saw to that. Then my father. I just continued it." He shook his head at that, not in disagreement exactly, but in the way of a man who has thought about something long enough to know that the modest version of the story is not the complete one. He had been one of the first people to bring her a horse after the pool sale story had calcified into the community's fixed account of who she was. He had stood at her fence and watched her work, and then told men she was worth their trust, and he had done it without fully understanding what he was supporting, and he had then watched his confidence in her be correct in ways that he had not anticipated. He had also watched his own operation collapse in ways he had not anticipated, and had spent the intervening years with the specific knowledge of a man who has been given one clear illustration of what the wrong arithmetic costs. He said, "I knew your father well enough to know that he planned further ahead than most people thought to." She said, "He planned as far as the ground could see. I tried to do the same." Fletcher picked up the auger from the fence post on his way back to his wagon. He drove out the east road in the direction of his farm, which was 8 years smaller than it had been the last time the two of them had stood together at a fence line in October. The 440 acres were fully under Lottie's operational management by the following spring. The account at the Holt County Bank had a balance that the new man Graves had described to a colleague in Sedalia as deeply unusual for an agricultural operation of that acreage in this county. He had not named a figure. He had not needed to. The colleague understood the register. The horseshoe inventory on the east wall of the shop stood at more than 800 units, cataloged and labeled in two different hands. Verity's script, which was small and slanted slightly left, and Lottie's, which was upright and precise, the way of someone who had learned to write with an awareness that clarity was a form of efficiency. The two scripts ran alongside each other on the labels without confusion, the way two people's work runs alongside each other when they have been doing the same work long enough to have learned it from the same source. On a morning in the spring of 1904, Verity was at the bench when a girl came into the shop. Not Lottie, a girl from 2 farms north, 10 years old, who had been coming around the property since the previous summer with the specific purposefulness of a child who has found the thing that interests her and is not yet old enough to know she is supposed to moderate that interest in the presence of adults. Her name was Ida, and her father ran a decent wheat operation, and she had no connection to the horseshoe story or the Farrier work or any of the history that lived in this building, except the connection of having arrived at the right place at the right time for reasons she probably could not have articulated. Verity gave her a piece of scrap iron and told her to cut it along the grain. She did not tell her which direction the grain ran. She did not tell her how to find it. Ida held the piece for a long time, turning it in her hands. She made the first cut in the wrong direction and felt the resistance and stopped. She turned the piece. She made the second cut in the right direction and felt it go through cleanly, and she looked up. Verity was at the bench, not looking at her. There was nothing to say about what had just happened, because what had happened was correct, and correctness did not require comment. This was the shop's instruction, the one that had never been written down because writing it down would have changed what it was. Try, feel the resistance, adjust, try again. The grain of the iron told you what it needed if you were paying the right kind of attention. Most people weren't. Most people pushed through the resistance and called the difficulty a property of the iron, rather than information about the direction. Lottie came through the shop door with a set of field stakes from the barn on her way somewhere with a purpose, and she stopped when she saw the girl at the bench with the scrap iron. She looked at the piece, at the 2 cuts, at the girl's face, which had the expression of someone who has just learned something that changes the category of what they were looking at. And she looked at Verity. Verity did not look up from the bench. She turned the piece she was working, assessed it, made a correction. Outside through the east window, the wheat on the new ground was coming up in the long, even rows that indicated the drainage work had held through the winter. The fence line that marked the old boundary between Calhoun ground and Stritch ground was still there. The posts and wire that Olin Stritch's grandfather had put up in some year before anyone in this room had been born. But the ground on both sides of it was the same ground now. Under the same management, worked by the same hands, with the same attention to what the soil was asking for versus what the season made easy. 30 years earlier, a girl in a wool coat had put 35 cents on the tailgate of a wagon at the Dillard Pool farm sale, and the men standing around that wagon had laughed, not cruelly, just with the complete and comfortable certainty of people watching something that did not matter. The iron in the crate she carried home that day was the iron in the boxes on the east wall shelf, reorganized and labeled and drawn from in the daily work of an operation that had been built on it the way that all real operations are built. Not on what was obviously valuable, but on what the patient eye could see and what everyone else had already decided was without use. The girl at the bench set the scrap iron down. She looked at the 2 cuts. She picked it up again and turned it in her hands, feeling now for something she had not known to feel for 30 seconds earlier, running her thumb across the surface in the tentative exploratory way of someone learning to read in a new language. The shop was quiet except for the sounds of the work. The forge was cold this morning. The work at the bench was cold work, not requiring it, but it would be lit again tomorrow, in the same corner where it had been burning since Silas Calhoun was a young man learning to read the color of heated iron from a blacksmith in Dade County, who had been doing it since before the territory was a state. The forge operated by the same principles it had always operated by: fuel, air, heat, and the willingness of the person tending it to wait for the right color before moving. Outside, the spring morning was doing what spring mornings in Holt County did, arriving with the particular indifference of weather that has no opinion about the human affairs occurring beneath it. The wheat was coming. The ground was paid for. The tools were on the wall above the bench in the arrangement that made the next motion easier, each one in a position that had been reasoned out rather than inherited. Though by now the reasoning had become so embedded in the arrangement that it was indistinguishable from the arrangement itself. That was the kind of knowledge this shop contained. The kind that looked from the outside like the accumulated accidents of a woman who had started by buying rusted iron at a dead man's farm sale. The kind that looked from the inside like the only way forward that had ever made sense.